Derbyshire on the far end here, who is president of the Royal Institute of British Architects. We have Jonathan Moore, who is from ACOM, and finally we have Ike Iger from Policy Exchange. Now, the way we're going to run this is I'm going to ask all the panelists to make brief opening statements, just a couple of minutes to give us a sense of what their views on fundraising, what placemaking should be, and what government should be achieving for. We'll then have a bit of a discussion here, throw it out to questions, and we're all wrapped up in the hour. And I'm going to ask this now, because I'm going to ask this again when we come to questions. Questions, not statements, please, so we can get as much from the panel as possible. So, I'm going to be kicking off with Councillor Ali Brown. Placemaking, what is it to you?
Thank you. So I'm Abby Brown. I'm leader of Stoke-on-Trent City Council. I'm one of a very small number of female Conservative city leaders, which gives me a platform to make outlandish statements like saying Stoke-on-Trent is the litmus test for levelling up nationally. And it's great to see so many people here to hear about Stoke-on-Trent as well, I have to say, this morning. Stoke-on-Trent, it's a polycentric city, and one of the things that has been really important to me in terms of our narrative is how you define that. So we're one of the very few places nationally that is still defined by what we make. Potteries, that's what we're called, and people like me are obsessed with turning over their crockery to see where it was made. We are 6 towns, but in one city, and part of my challenge over the last 7 years has been how you can bring that together in a cohesive agenda, and I think very mindful as well about how it can be quite corrosive sometimes if you get that narrative wrong. So there's a need to balance there between your wider entity, Stoke-on-Trent is a city of about 250,000 people, versus what it's like to have 6 unique other places within that. And of course, nobody knows your place better than you do as a local council leader, but scale is equally important, and that's why I think the role of local government is incredibly important around places and productivity in particular. So I would say that small is beautiful sometimes within the case of Stoke-on-Trent, but also you need an element of scale to deliver across these things. And where does the debate around MCAs fit into that with regard to unitary authorities such as my own? Very strong focus on place and placemaking for us as a city. I've been very fortunate over the last 7 years to have caught the attention of successive Secretaries of State, worked indeed closely with Michael over recent months, and very much needing to develop an understanding around how you fit and flex your narrative as a place to fit that of government, but also, may I say, how I flexed and fitted on narrative to influence government itself as well. Because I think it's important to see placemaking as being very wide. One of the things in particular that I'm incredibly proud of under Michael's tenure is to be able to sign one of the first informal deals with Homes England in the country, very much driving around moving away from just a housing agenda. We've been very successful as a place in terms of housing, but actually how that fits a wider place-making ecology, really. And that width very much informed our prospectus, really around the things that we saw were important to lead to a more successful city, and one of those out of the 4 was indeed health and productivity, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. And finally, I guess I would say in terms of levelling up, whether we call it levelling up or something else, if we want to see the full extent of the ability of places like Stoke-on-Trent to achieve their productivity potential, then we need to improve things. We need to ensure that a child who's born today in Stoke-on-Trent is able to live as long a life as a child elsewhere in the country. They're able to access education of the same ability and standard. They're able to access jobs, recruitment and a house, indeed wider surroundings as they would do anywhere else in the country. So I'm really keen to influence government agenda around that, but also hear what they've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, let's now move on to Ben. Do you want to give yourself and give us your view on placemaking with a less political hat on?
So yes, okay, I'm a past president of the RIBA, actually. I'm also the president of the London Forum of Community and Civic Societies, which puts me basically from a community perspective in all of this. And I'm chair of a leading housing and placemaking practice called HTA Design. I'm a commissioner of Historic England, but I am not speaking on behalf of Historic England this morning. So I want to characterise the kind of place that I have in mind when we're talking about levelling up and placemaking. I'm thinking of one of the typical mill town. I'm thinking that it's got a glorious listed town hall. It's surrounded by a conservation area. The conservation area is registered at risk, and in the register it's noted as having not experienced any positive change recently. There's 30% vacant retail space. Almost all the flat service shops are vacant. The general residential vacancy rate in the town is double the national average. That's the kind of place that I'm thinking of. It's a beautiful place. It was built by the Victorians. It was a mill town, and out from its lovely centre radiate workers' cottages, which still serve a very useful purpose, and glorious views of the hills around it. The things I'd like to address today are the policy framework that's really genuinely going to address the fortunes of such a place as that. I want to recognise the civic dimension of levelling up, the importance of recognising that it's a public good we are seeking here, and that therefore public investment at local level is necessary, and that investing public money at scale in both the renovation and improved insulation of social housing and the construction of new factory-built, high-quality homes on brownfield sites for such places as that is a way of building back better for our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Let us now go to Ike Iger from Policy Exchange, who has done a lot of work on this area. Give us your thoughts on place.
Right, morning everybody. Well, without stating the obvious, I think places and placemaking are essential. They're essential to livable, healthy cities and to the kind of economic recalibration the government wants to see through levelling up. It's not enough to have wonderful exemplar works of individual architecture. The spaces between them, the streets that link them all together, have to be as good, if not better, than the individual components. So I'm glad the government seems to be aware now, certainly through the white paper, of the primacy of places and how important it is to get that kind of fabric or network of streets and spaces between buildings right. Now, obviously, there's a productivity kind of lag with this country. In terms, certainly, compared to other countries, OECD averages are second tier of cities like Birmingham here, Manchester, Belfast, don't produce simply as well as other European cities. So there has to be a way in which we improve that. How can placemaking improve that? I think can improve that by if we focus on 5 key, very quick and simplistic kind of ambitions. The first is, and I would say this because I'm from Policy Exchange and we've promoted it for several years, is we have to build better. We have to build beautiful buildings and beautiful spaces. We can argue all day about whether beauty is subjective or whether it's in the eye of the beholder or whether they're kind of absolute comprehensive ideals which you can attain to beauty. But regardless of that, we have to improve the quality of our architecture and our spaces and our environment. Secondly, we need better planning. I know it's an easy kind of label for an incredibly complex issue, but the planning system needs to be reformed, it needs to be improved. And we've seen in the last few days the government moving towards investment zones, which some might say are kind of a repackaging of enterprise zones, but the principle there is not a bad one. They've worked in the past, we saw what they did in Canary Wharf and other areas, so the idea of maybe streamlining planning and making it quicker, but while retaining beauty and quality, is not necessarily a bad one. So we need to, planning is core to this as well. We need better infrastructure. We need to make sure that all the supportive infrastructure and network for places, transport particularly, healthcare, livable spaces, parks, all the kind of infrastructure that places need in order to work need to be supported, and if necessary, by public investment so that private development can be attracted, minimizing risk but increasing certainty. Fourthly, I think we need, as Ben alluded to, we need to get really clever about adapting existing heritage assets. If you look at some of the most deprived parts of this country, deprived cities, you'd be stunned at the amount of wonderful heritage. It may not be in a wonderful condition, but the assets are there. The tools of rebirth are there, but we need to find a strategy whereby those buildings can be regenerated and can play a role in the kind of rebirth and regeneration of these places we like to see. And finally, very importantly, as far as I'm concerned, I think we need to, the way to make placemaking increase productivity is to ensure that whatever's done is done as much as possible with democratic consent. I think that's really important. I think the democratic consent angle is what potentially is going to make the investment zones make or break. If people think these things are being imposed upon them, they'll react differently to if they feel part of a kind of process. So some methodology needs to be found whereby people in areas don't don't feel as if things are being done to them, but they're being part of it. And just find the democratic consent idea is really important, because you're not going to get placemaking or good places without a sense of civic and local pride. And you don't get pride if people don't like places, places where they live or what's been done to them, or if they don't feel that they've been part of the process. So pride is key, and I think democratic consent is a kind of key way of getting to that level of pride and involvement.
Thank you very much, Ike. There you are, 5-point ready-made plan. There you are, getting claps as well. Jonathan, do you want to take us off next? And obviously, you do a lot of work in the North of England as well, and have been thinking us through regeneration and levelling up. What are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, hi everybody. So I'm Jonathan Moore with ACOM, the regional director for ACOM in the North of England. ACOM is one of the largest infrastructure companies, professional services companies in the world, and delivered some extraordinary projects in the past, London 2012 amongst more notable ones. The focus I have on the Levelling Up agenda is actually about the integration of all of these areas that need to come together at the right time to allow the impact of levelling up to happen quickly. There are many initiatives, and we've heard all those this morning, and they're all quite right in terms of the focus on the human, the physical, the infrastructure, all that's absolutely right. Without an integrator leading the delivery of these infrastructure areas, these things won't happen at pace, won't happen at scale, won't happen with a good investment model behind them. And you know, the way those successful economies have moved forward, like Greater Manchester, have done that by having a very joined-up approach to the delivery of levelling up. They've integrated rail, they've integrated transit systems, they've integrated local area conurbation discussions. And ACOM, who've got a very clear grasp and leadership of integrated rail, transit, building, adaptation, building design and delivery, are very well placed to bring this forward very quickly. Our ask of government is to be very clear and very committed to this, give us a long-term plan. We know that many of the rail companies would invest longer, they had longer operating agreements because they need to have a return on investment. So we need clarity from government on where they're going to invest, what they're going to invest in, how they're going to invest, and be very clear about the method and engagement of local communities. At ACOM, we do this very successfully around the world, and we've done it very successfully in the UK context as well, and we're in a good position to move these things forward. So I'm very encouraged by the clarity of thought and the commitment to levelling up, and you know, we stand very well and ready to commit to that.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Michael Gove, you obviously will have some great thoughts on this from your time as Levelling Up agenda. When you looked at the white paper and what you did, how did your theory of place fit into that, and what is placemaking for you?
Well, all the contributors on the panel have emphasised the importance of not relying on one single tool in order to transform a community and to ensure that places that have been overlooked and undervalued in the past can succeed. And in the Levelling Up white paper, we talked about what we called a Medici model, and I recognise that this may not be perhaps the most user-friendly phrase. It may be that in the high streets in Tunstall and Burslem, talking about a Medici model will make people think about birthday cards rather than anything else. But what we were seeking to do was to stress, as Abby was talking about, the importance of bringing together different types of capital, different types of investment, and different types of actor in order to ensure that you can successfully make a place which is already attractive to its residents, attractive for investment as well, and where you can take that latent sense of civic pride and turn it into something transformative. And again, if we take Stoke-on-Trent, if we take the 6 towns as a model, it has many of the ingredients that we need. It has, as Abby pointed out, a strong sense of civic identity. It has a global reputation because of its ceramics industry. It has some beautiful historic architecture. It has a significant new employer in Bet365. It has a football club, which, while not currently in the Premiership, well, it has Stoke and Port Vale, you're telling me, absolutely. But it has in Stoke City Football Club, with a great tradition, and Port Vale a football club with a nice ground. And it also has enterprising and attractive citizens. But there are 1 or 2 areas where more requires to be done. Some of the government agencies which are responsible for investment in Stoke haven't been sufficiently well coordinated. That is a factor across the country, where you can sometimes have organisations from those responsible for our railways to those responsible for our highways to those responsible for urban regeneration not integrating successfully. And that is why, as Abby quite rightly points out, a strong civic leader with the power to convene and knock heads together is absolutely vital. Another challenge for Stoke is that schools have been too poor for too long. And again, a particular responsibility on central government is making sure that strong civic leadership is able to challenge underperformance in schools as well. If we broaden the debate out beyond just some of the changes that will make Stoke sing, it's also the case that wherever we look, whether it's Stoke, Burnley, Blackpool, Grimsby, as well as great architecture, attractive buildings, scope for investment and development in the future, cultural investment, which is key, sporting centres of loyalty and focus, which are important. There are two or three other things which I would briefly mention. One is the importance of green spaces. Again, it's been emphasised across this panel. The built environment, but also the natural environment, need to be integrated in such a way as to make sure that people have places to work, rest and play, and safe places in which families can relax. And that takes me to the second thing, which is safer streets. And a critical component of levelling up is making sure that you have that sense 24 hours a day that people can enjoy the public realm. And that again is why the work that Suella and others have been doing to refocus the efforts of police on public order first and foremost are so important. And then the final thing that I would say, and this is perhaps one of the most difficult, is communities like Stoke have more than one high street. And it is tough for the principal high street in towns anyway, commercially, for the reasons that we've just heard, to keep themselves lively and attractive and places where people want to go when we have a hollowing out of the retail sector. But it's even tougher when you're thinking not just about Stoke-on-Trent as a town centre, but also Tunstall, Burslem and the other towns. And a critical part of that is making sure that you have the tools to ensure that landlords, if properties are lying empty for too long, are, if necessary, compelled to rent them out, either to new enterprises or to new social enterprises. And giving local people the tools to do that means that start-up companies, but also the civic organisations that could play such an important part in levelling up, have the chance to flourish. So I know that what I mentioned is something of a list, but if you open a recipe book, the ingredients will be there in a list. The art is making sure that you bring them all together at the right time, at the right temperature, and that is what great civic leaders like Abby should be empowered to do.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now, I'm just going to use Chair's prerogative here to try and do an artful question to take the topic of this onto matter du jour. Now, of course, now the 45p tax rate has been scrapped. That's an extra £2 billion that could go into placemaking and levelling up. Is that what you would like to see?
Well, I think that it's already the case that, as we've discussed, Liz and Simon Clark have made it clear that what they want to do is to put extra energy behind levelling up. Some of that is going to be through enterprise zones, which offer a chance for, and democratic consent is an important part of this, but they offer the chance for local communities to embrace faster planning and tax breaks in order to encourage the sort of investment that we want to see supercharged. I think that is a very good thing. I think it's also the case, though, and I think it's important to look beyond the simple arithmetic that you quite rightly home in on, Seb. I think it's important to recognise local government continues to need to be funded appropriately. During the austerity period of 2010 to 2014-15, one of the areas that took the biggest hit was local government expenditure.
70% cut in the central government funding between 2010 and 2020, I think.
And I can understand both why that was done, but it's also important that we, as Simon, when he was Chief Secretary of the Treasury, did, ensure that local government gets the necessary additional resource that it requires. And part of that is helping not just to get central government support for local government, it's also helping to broaden the tax base. And I think that Liz and her team are looking in the whole realm of business taxes and other areas at ways in which we can ensure that communities that haven't necessarily had that broad and deep tax base can do so.
So what about business rates then? Because that's one area, I think if you went to all the places we've been talking about on this panel, people would love to see business rates cut to help those high streets and to encourage investment, but that's a very important line for the Exchequer.
Yes, it is, and I think that there is scope to reform business rates, and again, Ben Houchin, another levelling up hero, has made it clear that that is the logical direction in which local government reform should go. But as well as reform, you also, as you quite rightly point out, need to think about the rate at which things are levied, and of course, the Treasury and the Levelling Up Department, I think, are looking at the way in which business rates operate, with a particular emphasis on making sure that any revaluation that occurs is pro-enterprise.
Then last question, we'll go back to the rest of the panel as well. Everyone here has been talking about planning and reform here.
Yep.
Now, when Liz Truss became Prime Minister, she announced that planning reform was going to be returned to, and of course when you were levelling up Secretary, this was something the department dealt with, really struggled to get in your head, where you had a big backlash from Conservative MPs in the south of England. The fact is, if you want to make better places elsewhere in England, doesn't that require taking a hit for the south and building on some more of the green and pleasant land to help places like Stoke?
I think one shouldn't I think one shouldn't oversimplify. There are two things. One, in order to ensure that you get the housing and indeed the other economic development that you need in cities like Stoke and elsewhere, then you need to have the government playing a part. And it is the role of Homes England to, first of all, make sure, when you have urban redevelopment, you will often have a patchwork of small sites. You need to bring them together, and you will often need work to remediate the land because of the industrial consequences for the environment of the previous use. So Historic England has a critical role, not Historic England also has a critical role to play. Homes England has a critical role to play in bringing that together, and then you need the private sector to bring that investment. King's Cross, for example, brilliant example of that, and what is happening in Manchester now and what has happened in Birmingham show what you can achieve. We need to make sure that in our other cities and towns that happens. But with respect to planning reform elsewhere, I think that there are 5 things that need to be done, and Policy Exchange's work has touched on all of these. The first thing is you need to build beautiful. So beauty is a critical part of it. Again, beauty will, depend on the eye of the beholder. But one thing I would just briefly say is that Poundbury and Nansledden, 2 of the developments that our King was responsible for when he was Prince of Wales and in charge of the Duchy of Cornwall, may not necessarily be to everyone's tastes. However, undeniably aesthetically attractive, and more to the point, if you buy a house in Poundbury, it will cost more, it will have a higher price, greater value than homes in Dorchester of equivalent square footage. It is the case that you have a new development that is more attractive, literally more attractive and financially more attractive. The other great thing about Poundbury and Nansledden is that as you walk round both communities, and they are walkable, you can't tell the difference between the homes for social rent and homes that people own. So they are organic communities. It is a great initiative that the Prince of Wales led. So when it comes to beauty and architecture, my motto is God save the King. But we also need to make sure that there is adequate infrastructure there. When we're talking about planning reform, our infrastructure levy, which I think Simon is going to take forward, will help ensure more money for local government for the public services they need. You also need, exactly as Policy Exchange have argued for, a democratic role in that. And then you also need, again, as Policy Exchange has argued, to look at the environmental externalities and make sure that you have policies, again, Policy Exchange policies like environmental and biodiversity net gain alongside. Final thing is you need to have a sense of neighbourhood. It's important when you're thinking about additional planning developments that you don't simply plonk new identical housing estates on already existing communities. They need to feel, as Poundbury does, like a proper neighbourhood. If you add up those things, B, beauty, I, infrastructure, D, democracy, E, environment, N, neighbourhood, you come up with an acronym which is Biden. This may be the only time that I will endorse Biden on a public platform. But as well as being pro-King, in this respect, I'm pro-Biden as well.
Well, there you are. There's a real scoop for you. Now, I just want to come back to some other people on the panel as well. Abby, you talked here about provision of public services in terms of, I think, health you mentioned as well. And this is obviously a big issue with regards to the levelling up agenda, that a lot of these places, Michael mentioned the central government funding cuts, which has really affected some of the poorest parts of the country. But it's a very long-term issue to try and improve this stuff. You can't just throw money and get instant results. And I think there is one concern that, obviously, Michael's left the levelling up department. We've got a different direction of this government. There's not enough focus on really improving the outcome of public services. How can you deal with that when you're a local council with the chops and changes of Whitehall?
I think really it's about resetting the debate, isn't it, in terms of what certainly local government provides. So we provide over 700 services as a unitary authority, everything from libraries right the way through to repairing roads. We look after children, older people, public health, a whole variety of things. And the reality is, yes, absolutely. When I'm knocking on doors in Stoke-on-Trent, people are asking me about when their roads are going to be fixed, when the grass is going to be cut and things like that. Nobody ever asks me about the 1,000 children in care that we have today in Stoke-on-Trent, or indeed the incredibly high levels of adults who are in care homes when actually they probably ought to be at home, having been supported to live independently. But I think that's really easy to overlook because they aren't the things that are being raised, but they are arguably the most important things that we do as local government. So I think it is really important that when we have discussions around local government finance, that it is about those things. Today, over 60% of my budget is being spent on social care for adults and children, and the remainder is being spent on the things that actually I've spent all of this morning talking about in a variety of different forums, and we have to look at those things in the round. And it is, as Michael has alluded to, a reflection of all of those things. Our prospectus that we issued last year picks up on 4 things that we believe would improve things in Stoke-on-Trent: transport within the city, economic development, education and skills, and health and productivity. And for me, we have to achieve on all 4 of those to ensure that a child today in Stoke-on-Trent is able to enjoy the same quality of life growing up as children elsewhere.
Thank you. Now, Ben, you mentioned here about sort of the beauty in some of these places, the natural beauty, and I think you talked about the mill towns built by the Victorians, and of course I wouldn't be doing an event without mentioning that I've written a book on this topic, which is available in paperback in all good WH ships now, Broken Heartlands. And and when you said that, it reminded me a lot of Burnley in Lancashire, which was a place that has got some stunning architecture, really stunning architecture, and they struggled to know what to do with the old chimneys, for example, from the cotton mills, because there's about 50 of them. When you arrive into Burnley, they pepper the skyline. Some people said, well, let's get rid of them. They're the past. They don't actually serve any use. Other people said, well, actually, they add to the character and the innate sense of place to what Burnley is. How do you get that balance between something of the past, but it actually has no form for the future? Because a lot of these towns that need better placemaking struggle with this.
Okay. First of all, let me say that it's absolutely clear, and I'm not just saying this because I'm on the same panel as him, that Michael Gove gets it. And it's a great shame, actually, that Michael, you were cut off on your prime just as you were going to get going, because I'm not at all sure that the current suite of policies is going to do the job that you want to see getting done. Somebody said in a town like, did you mention Burnley?
I did.
A local councillor said to me quite recently, the problem here is that we need to make our town centre a destination for the people of this town, and it's not. What we've been doing over the last years, decades, is creating destinations for people who live in such places that are out of town, that are miles away, where you have to go by car to reach them. The central point here, is that we have a new crisis. I mean, I really think it's a desperate situation for places like this. They are horribly empty. The streets are occupied by rough sleepers and petty crime. People don't go there. And yet, as I say, they have intrinsic, inherent, great beauty, and most important of all, they're contributing not one jot to the climate crisis. They are filled with embodied carbon. We need, as a country, to occupy every square foot of pre-existing space or existing built footprint as a fundamental part of dealing with the climate crisis. So what I'm saying about all of that, to answer your question, is that local authorities need the resource, and Michael Gove mentioned this, but I know, there are no enforcement officers, there are no conservation officers, there are no town centre managers in many of the places of which I speak. And if they're going to deliver a response which must have the green and blue networks that we're hearing about, it must have the open spaces, it must have means by which the people who live in these terraces of small houses that I'm talking about can actually reach the town centre, because generally speaking they're cut off by road schemes which in many cases are not under the control of that local authority. There's a lot to do. It's an exercise in civic leadership and urban design that's required, and most small places of the kind that I'm talking about don't have the resource.
And I think the rise of out-of-town sort of shopping centres has played a big part of this in a lot of these towns. That, if you think of Consett in County Durham, the town centre is very much struggling, as you would say. But you go outside and there's a massive Asda and shops that you can all drive in and do all that sort of thing. I just wanted to pick you up on your point here about the democratic consent. Now, one thing that the new Truss government has been getting into is fracking, for example, by saying that we're going to go ahead with fracking if local people want it. And I'm willing to put a bet with every single person in this room that there will be no fracking, because no one is going to say, yes, I would absolutely love to have fracking at mine next door. So isn't the problem a democratic consent that actually if you're trying to take decisions on a national or even a regional level, it just gets more and more micro and nothing ever actually gets done?
Yes, basically. You have encapsulated the problem. And there is very often, thank you, Ben, there's very often a contradiction between national need and local benefit. And there's many examples of that. We talked about transport in the last session. I mean, HS2 is a wonderful example of that. Regardless of what you think about HS2, you can table an argument for its national purpose, but if you live in a village that's going to be split in two by the railway, then you don't see much of a local benefit to that. So there has to be a way of squaring the two. Now, traditionally, the way of squaring the two would be by going through democratic processes, encouraging, coercing people to agree, if you like, with this thing happening to them. But I think we have to get much more intelligent about how we deal with public consultation and about how we deal with consulting the public about these big measures, because I understand the difficulty, I understand the challenge. It's very hard to get everybody to agree on everything, and it's unrealistic to expect that you can only have projects go ahead if everybody agrees with them. But it's such a fundamentally important part of urban development, I feel, getting people to have a kind of emotional investment or buying into it, that we have to find a strategy to do it. I'm not sure what the strategy is. I'm sure there are people far more adept than me in government that are working out what the strategy should be. I mean, one way of it could be, I'm not saying this is the absolute outcome, but it's something that Policy Exchange has looked at, is possibly polling. Not using polling to determine planning applications, I'm not saying that, but polling so that you can at least gauge what people feel about what's being done to their environment. Just ask them the question. Asking people questions just makes them feel empowered, whether you listen to the answer or not. But maybe that might be one kind of way in terms of trying to get this local support for controversial, complicated schemes through. I admit I don't know the answer, but I think it's a very important challenge.
You came very close to mentioning the dreaded word of citizens' assemblies, which I believe is Gordon Brown's solution for every problem the country faces.
I deliberately didn't mention
I noticed you didn't. And then finally, Jonathan, before we throw this out to questions from the audience, you talked about delivery and getting stuff done very quickly. And, obviously, Michael, you were in Levelling Up for 9 months. You did the white paper. But in terms of trying to get Levelling Up done, this government's sort of 3 years old. And there is a bit of a sense across the country that people can't feel it, they can't see it. And we've got a new Levelling Up secretary who's talked about 100 priority infrastructure projects. And as far as I can see, that's going a list and just saying, right, we want these things done. But there's not really much sense inside government about how you get these things delivered. What's your answer to that? And what is the problem? Is it Whitehall inertia? Is it ministers? Is it funding? Is it yourselves who've not got capacity to help get these things through?
Yeah, no, we've certainly got capacity to get things through. I think, like most plans, and Michael made the point about you have a list of ingredients, you bring them together, and you get the outcome you're trying to achieve. The balance of ingredients, timing, and decision-making does lead you to deliver at scale, at pace. What I would say to governments is that the way they raise finance for public sector funding is not very joined up. So you could get a rail company looking at their rail infrastructure investment. Clearly, technically, it's going to be safe and healthy and all that sort of thing. And you'll find that the regeneration teams that work within the same rail company or operating company don't talk to each other. So the opportunity to integrate housing regeneration with low carbon travel, as Greater Manchester have done, and all of the stations around Greater Manchester, they're now looking at air rights development over these stations by bringing together partners of the GM, the Metro Mayor, and the local rail company. So the first point that the public sector needs to do is to stop and think about the alignment of the process. Michael's made the point about some investment zones, speed up planning, policy making, process, decision making. That's the sort of thing that should be done at an operational scale to allow the funding process to come forward quickly. Also look at the means of funding it. I work with Homes England through ACOM quite often. They can get initial funding to do brownfield redevelopment, but the actual major funding required to do the preparatory work to move that forward isn't aligned to the process. So it's another gap while you wait for the next bit of funding. Local authorities don't have the money to fund upfront some of the work they need to do to get the funding in place justified through the business case. So it's a sort of process that's slightly out of step, and it just slows the whole thing up. When you take that on a scale and you take that up to a portfolio level, you do get problematic delivery issues. And that point I made about the clarity, the guarantees, the commitment from government through local authority and devolved mayorships, whatever it might be, needs to be there and needs to be held together. And then there needs to be a feedback loop that allows things to change if we need to move quicker. So the answer is that there's an alignment and process consolidation requirement needed. And it's a big challenge because government departments are many and varied, and they're not integrated particularly well. But we should have an integrated plan, a delivery plan with a delivery solution, with a fully costed business case. Then we can move much quicker. So that's the issue that needs to be brought forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, now to the favourite part, questions from the audience. I'm going to remind you of my advice at the beginning, which we want to get as many of you in as possible. So we're going to have questions, not statements, and we'll try and get a variety of different people. Now I'm going to take two to begin with. I'll start with Alva from Politico over here, and this lady on the front here. Thank you.
Thank you. Mainly a question from Michael, please. I don't know if you saw yesterday that Rachel Wolfe, one of the co-authors of the 2019 manifesto, one of the big brains behind Levelling Up, said on a panel yesterday that the government has essentially ditched all of those 2019 promises. And you maybe haven't seen that within the past hour, your former cabinet colleague Nadine Dorries has tweeted that there is widespread dismay at the fact that 3 years of work has effectively been put on hold. If Liz wants a whole new mandate, she must take it to the country. Do you agree with your former cabinet colleague?
Thank you. Do you want me to get the question from the front here as well, please? Thank you. Oh, there we are. Pass the parcel on the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, Noah Hoffman from The Sun. Your former cabinet colleague, Jacob Rees-Mogg, just described the U-turn on the 45p tax cut as sound and fury signifying nothing. Would you agree with that categorisation? And how would you describe the atmosphere of Tory conference this year versus last year? For me, I think there's been quite a significant mood shift in a negative direction. But I was wondering if you've experienced the same and whether you think the Conservative Party will win the next general election.
Great, there we are. A nice few helpful questions from my great journalistic colleagues here. We'll get some others. Michael, would you like to take all those and go? So we'll start with Alva's question about levelling up and what Rachel Wolfe said. It does feel like something has changed quite significantly.
I think it's a natural thing for journalists, of which I used to be one, and commentators, to take any change and to overemphasise the scale and nature of that change. I remember when I was training as a journalist in Newcastle, I was told by an ex-news editor that the essence of journalism was to simplify and then exaggerate. And this is no criticism either of Politico, the New Statesman, or The Sun, to say that that is a natural way in which complex political questions will be refracted through the prism of popular media. I know, I've been there, I've done that, I'm as guilty as anyone. Rachel is brilliant and a great friend. I think she is erring towards pessimism. I think it is vitally important that we remember the basis on which Conservatives won the 2019 election, and it's not about, the red wall or red wall voters, notwithstanding the brilliant book by Seb. It is about governing for the whole country and recognising that there are people who place their trust in this government because they had been let down in the past, and we mustn't, and we've run through many of the reasons why, there are important policy questions that need to be addressed for those people. We mustn't forget them, and we need to carry on. I actually think that some of the points that have been made, we touched on earlier about enterprise zones and looking at business rates, reflect a commitment to absolutely press ahead with levelling up. I used a different analogy last night, another cooking analogy. I said that sometimes, while the aroma of the broth is the same and the basic ingredients are retained, you might add a little bit of paprika here or a little less garlic there, and that is what a new Prime Minister is entitled to do and should do to take account of prevailing circumstances. On Nadine's point, again, I'm sure it will be the case that Liz will be carrying forward lots of the very good work that Nadine did at DCMS. On Noah's point, Jacob, of course, in quoting Shakespeare, is reminding us that he is the single best-read man in Parliament. Again, there is always a Shakespeare quote for any eventuality in politics, as I've also learnt. But there's no one better to quote the bard than Jacob. Difference in atmosphere. Again, I think there is a different atmosphere, but that's because we have a different Prime Minister and also because the world faces a set of crises even more acute this autumn than it did last, and we're operating against that backdrop. And will the Conservatives win the next election? Yes. And just last question to you, the point about Nadine Dorries saying we should have a general election, I assume you're not gunning for that at the moment? Well, at some point in the next 2 and a bit years, we should have a general election. Right, okay, But my view of the general election is like my view of the mooted independence referendum in Scotland. Now is not the time. Okay, thank you. Right, let's get some other questions. Have this fellow here, please, and we'll go for this lady on the front. Thank you. If we get some microphone just to chat with the white shirt there.
James Riding from React News. Something that Liz Truss talked a lot about in her leadership campaign as a way of encouraging levelling up was to repeal things like Solvency II, and which would, in her view, free up money that investors and pension funds and insurers could invest into towns and regions and things. Is there anything in that? Is that something that is that worth exploring, or is it potentially a red herring? Thank you very much. And it's the lady. Oh, sorry, and the lady at the front here. Thank you. We can just run the microphone over to here. Thank you very much.
Hi. Part one of the question is the Environment Agency fit for purpose? If we're going to have good place, if they're going to do their job when there are problems, do you think they're able to do it? Because I don't. And the other is essential workers' accommodation. We get the situation where developments go through planning on the basis they're going to build 20% or whatever of affordable or social housing. They then do a feasibility study and we literally never get it. And in the south of England, the main reason, I'm a county councillor and a borough councillor, that people turn down jobs they want is because they find they cannot simply afford to live there. That's fine when they're single because they say they're prepared to travel a couple of hours, but when they've got a family and children, they simply can't do that. And we have a real problem in the public sector filling spaces without essential.
Thank you very much. Do you want to take the question there about essential accommodation? I thought that was a very, very interesting point about how we can deal with that. And also, you must deal with the Environment Agency a lot. I can see by the smile on your face, you may have some views.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I've got to be honest, workers' accommodation is not an issue for us. So perhaps somebody else on the panel may be better to deal with that. But in terms of the Environment Agency, I think Michael touched on this actually, which is clearly part of the work that I did with him when he was Secretary of State, which is how do you get arm's length bodies to engage with you in an appropriate way? And perhaps some of my experience has been that they feel that they are between the two in a way that they don't necessarily have to respond to their paymasters, and neither do they need to respond to the public sector either. But actually my experience was that when you do have a good Secretary of State and good ministers, they can be brought into line around that and actually work very productively with you. And I'm not sure I want to specifically comment on the Environment Agency particularly. I've had experiences actually of some arm's length agencies that have behaved in a not great way, but equally some others who need no compelling whatsoever to actually work with us in a really positive way. But I think it's always helpful for them to be reminded that they are an arm of the government and therefore they should be doing what their Secretary of State wishes them to do, really.
Thank you. Ben, you had one to come in on essential
yes,
accommodation.
well, I mean, nobody wants ghettos of the rich or the poor. And it's unquestionably a fact that mixed neighbourhoods are popular, enjoyable, and, as you note, provide cities with the labour that they need to keep things moving. When I started my career, it was doing miscellaneous refurbishments of properties that had been bought by local authorities in order to provide accommodation for poor people, and quite large blocks of Victorian mansions, likewise. All of that has gone. And if we're going to succeed in revitalising my mill town, Homes England is going to have to turn itself into an organisation capable of refurbishing homes. Just on the question of insolvency too, and changes to the rules for investment, the degree of vacancy in flats over shops owned by institutional investors is 10 times higher than the amount of vacancy in premises owned by local landlords, which says, I think, something about the need for change in that sector.
Great, well, you answered both questions there. Thank you. Oh, do you want to come in quickly, Ike?
Just quickly on the affordability issue. This is something you hear all the time on schemes about planning applications being given and then feasibility assessments coming in and getting watering down the amount of affordable housing. Now, my solution to this, I'm not saying this will solve the housing crisis, but I think one thing which I hope this government will consider is politically controversial in terms of recent history, but I think we need to think about building more council housing again, because that's genuinely affordable housing, and we shouldn't look at it as something that's anti-Tory or conservative. Macmillan built thousands of council houses. The first council house in the world, I believe, in Boundary Estate in Shoreditch, was built under a Conservative government. But that's less important than the fact that council housing, in a kind of responsible way, avoiding some of the stigmas and design mistakes that happened in the past, can be a really good way of meeting this affordability problem we have in terms of housing. We can't leave the private sector to do everything.
Yeah. There we are. Right. Some more questions. I'm going to try and keep them this side of the room to get them as quick as possible, so I'm not making you run about. Can I go for Sasha on the front here, and then I'm going to go for David Goodhart there. Thank you.
Sasha O'Sullivan from City AM. What do you make of the kind of fears about austerity take two? And while it does feel like Jacob Rees-Mogg is a little in the rube at the moment, he's just compared you to the Tory Peter Mandelson. Is that how you see yourself?
And then David Goodhart as well, please.
Hi, David Goodhart from Policy Exchange. Many of the most left behind areas of the country that we're talking about when we talk about levelling up used to be industrial heartlands. We know that. And there's a lot of nostalgia in these places for industrial jobs. Now, clearly, we're never going to go back to the kind of manufacturing, industrial levels of the 1950s, but there are quite a few tricks we seem to be missing when it comes to regenerating industrial jobs. The biggest one of all is wind turbines. We are the Saudi Arabia of wind power. We have, for these great offshore wind farms, you have 60% is meant to be local content, and yet we build hardly any of the wind turbines in this country because the 60% local content is gamed by the Chinese consortia that bid successfely for these things, partly on the basis of the fact that their energy costs are so much lower because they produce their energy using coal. They end up building these turbines in Europe or in the Middle East or in China itself, and we have the potential in a lot of these green areas for creating new green industrial jobs that we're missing at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to try and make sure not every single question goes to Michael, but I'm going to put both of those to you now. So, the Tory Peter Mandelson.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to answer the question about Solvency II. Absolutely the right thing. Should have done it earlier. Liz, 110% correct on that. And a very welcome change in financial services regulation, which will ensure that a higher proportion of investable funds go into those parts of the UK that need them. That takes me to David Goodhart's question. I will come back. David makes a very good point. We need to have an industrial strategy. I think we have an industrial strategy for financial services, as it were, and a very successful one, but we need to have an industrial strategy more broadly. That doesn't mean picking winners, doesn't mean individual companies being told where and how to locate. It doesn't mean the direction of capital, but it does mean thinking about areas of strength, and one of those areas of strength that we have is renewables, and if we are thinking about the future, then in places like Teesside and Humberside, then we need to make sure that there's both a pipeline of skills, which mean that the jobs which are going to be generated by investment in those areas can increasingly be British jobs for British workers, as someone once said. On Sasha's point about austerity, it is obviously going to be very difficult for any government in any advanced Western democracy to deal with all of the economic pressures that we face. And Liz is quite right to say that taxpayers will expect us to make sure that every pound we spend, we secure additional value from. And there is a very good team in the Treasury and elsewhere absolutely focused on taxpayer value. As for being compared to Peter Mandelson, that's one of the nicest things that anyone has ever said about me in politics.
Okay. On the point about energy, because of course the Labour Party announced at their conference last week they're going to create GB Energy, which is a reflection of sort of EDF in France. And the idea then is to try and get through those green projects. Nuclear power is a big problem, for example. It keeps going to the private sector. It costs overrun, doesn't really actually make much progress. So would you support a big state energy company to make those supply chains that David was talking about abroad?
I'm not convinced that making Ed Miliband the chief executive in charge of Britain's industrial strategy and creating an energy company for him to run is necessarily the best way forward.
Oh, well, Ed Miliband might feel differently for that. Right, let's get some more questions in. And can I get Claire Fox there? Has got her hands up, and then I'll get the chat behind her as well. Make it nice and quickly just there. Thank you.
Very sympathetic to Ike's approach to the need to have more democratic involvement and discussion. The problem is that that's often interpreted as empowering local government. And let me assure you, for anyone who knows councils, that can be the opposite of local involvement. It can also mean giving a lot more power to NGOs and community activists. Again, got nothing to do with democracy. So I do think that we've got to get round this idea that you've got to stop talking down to people, but you've also got to stop seeing those government bodies as the same as local Democrats. And then a couple of odd things. LTNs, absolute disaster, destroying cities, and I'm afraid the Conservatives endorse that, and they've got to get rid of them. And secondly, something that Michael's done is the absolute dread of leaseholders. I mean, you can talk about a property-owning democracy, but if you buy a leasehold, you don't own your property, but you think you do, you were conned, right? And the government's got to speak out on these things. It's not just any good, say, in housing. You've got to look at the detail and do something about that, and abolish leaseholds straight away, in my view.
Thank you very much. Just pass the microphone straight behind you. Is that the gentleman there?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Abdul Mateen from the Isle of Wight Conservative Association. We were behind the polls until we won in 1992 with John Major. We are behind the polls now. Is history destined to repeat itself? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, I just want to, on the point about local people, Ike, do you want to take this? Because we talked about this before, at the sense of, local councils. I think a lot, I think Jacob Rees-Mogg, again, sort of omnipresent in this room, once sort of said that, the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 was one of the biggest crimes in legislative history because of the way it allows local governments to have those powers. How do you get that balance Claire was talking about? Because people obviously do want to have a say in the communities they live in, but we are in this kind of deadlock of trying to build better places.
I mean, Claire's point is completely valid. It is a thorny issue. We shouldn't mistake or confuse local democracy with all respect for local councils, but necessarily what the local council says or endorses. And regardless of your ideological view about them, about LTNs, Claire's right. A lot of LTNs were imposed without the kind of normal mechanism of public consultation or democratic consent that we would expect. So it's, again, I think, about being creative and coming up with new strategies that are a genuine or a more genuine reflection of what people feel or what people want. I'm not sure I have the answer for what that might be. I don't think, going back to Gordon Brown's Citizens' Assembly, that that's necessarily what it is, but I think we really, really need to think about what our relationship with democracy and consultation and people's representation is, because I think it's crucial that if we're really going to achieve levelling up, we have to achieve that relationship with the electorate as well.
Jonathan, can I get your view on local government as well? Because obviously you work very closely with them as well. Do you think Claire's got a point when you talk about all these issues in terms of LTNs and engagement, what have you, they're just a bit of a block on getting things done, or not?
Well, yeah, potentially. I mean, I think one of the things that we haven't talked about, but in the digital age that we're in, the ability to consult digitally by having some sort of platform where people can use data and insight on a sort of democratic basis is something that hasn't been embraced fully enough by local authority, local government. ACOM have these platforms that can be built very easily to create a democratic type data insight process. And I think if you look at the digitization of local authority and government generally, it's behind the curve. You know, thank God Amazon aren't focusing on local government services because they'd be wiped out overnight. But there's no value in it, so I suppose they won't. But the thing is, we've got to embrace some of these new technologies to allow the information to flow quicker, to be presented in a way where you can draw insight, to allow all of the data insights to be brought forward in a way that's uncontroversial, because you can do it through a portal or something. So that's something I would do to bring that forward. There's no doubt local decision making is and can be difficult, and I think, you know, anything that can streamline that, process it, pre-agree, pre-consult, get to a point of getting to a plan we can all get behind is to be welcome.
I just want to get Ben very quickly.
Yeah,
Let's get
well,
one last round
the
of
answer to
questions
Claire
in.
Fox, engagement. We do it all the time. My practice for local authorities, major clients, you work in local schools, you get down there, you take a container, you put a machine in it, people start making the furniture that they want, and you build trust, and then you can do planning for real. You can do co-design with people, and it works. It's terrific. Quite often local authorities don't like it because it usurps, as they see it, their position, but it really works. On the industrial point, I just want to say, we're making prefabricated homes, half the embodied carbon, half the energy consumption, and twice as quick to build, and that's where the government should put its money, in investing in building back better. We've done a study with Mark Farmer, the government czar, on prefabrication, 75,000 additionality here, new homes, and 50,000 new jobs in the north available with the current industrial base.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm going to try and get 3 final questions in here before we wrap up. This side of the room, should we do? So we've got the most hands up. We'll go here, and I'll do that fellow at the back there. Thank you very much. So we just go there. I'll do that fellow at the back there. Thank you very much. So we just go there, and then we'll have to sadly bring this to a bit of an end. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm from Newcastle, and up here it's as though when you look at planning, beauty is seen as sort of a luxury that's not needed to be addressed rather than a necessity. What can government do to put beauty back as a priority for planning across the country?
Great question. Thank you very much. It's just this gentleman here. Oh, no, sorry, back a few. There we are. That's it there. Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Neil Mendoza, the Commissioner of Culture at DCMS. We're talking a little bit about the fact that levelling up hasn't really started yet, or hasn't happened. There's been an enormous amount of levelling up going on over the last few years. Michael mentioned the sector that I work in the culture sector. And I was just thinking, is it worth us looking at joining up? We've been talking about joining up, all the things that we've been doing, so that we can talk about it, because otherwise we can't own it. So if you think about the Levelling Up Fund, Manifesto Commitment, Culture Investment Fund, Manifesto Commitment, the Borderlands Fund, all the incredible work that Ben's Historic England has been doing in high street action zones and so on. This is fantastic stuff that's been happening. We should have a lot of information about stuff.
Great. Thank you very much. And just the gentleman here for the last quick question. Thank you.
Hello?
Yep, there we are.
Mario Trabucco, Oldenburg from Parish Council. As a parish, we have been investing in an awful lot of resources in terms of money, time and other resources in making our neighborhood plan. And yet we see it overridden all the time by the inspectors, by the local authority, sometimes on the basis of the national planning policy framework. How good is it still as a way of shaping the community footprint?
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. Michael, do you want to take those last final points?
Yeah,
and I'll
yes,
go around
can I just ask the gentleman there, just out of genuine curiosity, which parish council? Forgive me, I didn't hear.
Oldenburn, West Sussex.
West Sussex, okay. Well, to take your point first, you are right. There are a number of ways in which the planning system works against its stated intentions. So neighbourhood plans are supposed to play a larger part, and it's also the case that if a local authority in good faith grants planning permission, which will lead to the 5-year land supply being assured, that it should be able to turn down speculative development in particular areas. But it doesn't work that way. And that is partly because of the way in which the planning inspectorate operates, but partly because of ambiguity in the way in which the legislation has been interpreted. There are some changes in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill which are designed to address specifically those problems, and I know that Simon and Lee Rowley are on it. But if you were to reinforce from your own personal experience to Lee and the team at DLUC, then I think that would really help. On Neil's point, yes, HAZs and much of the work of Historic England needs to be trumpeted more. Culture has played a critical part in the regeneration and revival of some of our great towns and cities, and we need to make sure both that it is a thread running through the whole tapestry, but also that we mustn't forget everything that's already been achieved, that we're on a journey and a significant number of steps have already been taken. And on the point about Newcastle is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And it has breathtaking architecture, and it's also an example of how having a great university, respect for civic pride, but also thinking again about industrial areas and how you can regenerate them can come together. So what can we learn from Newcastle? A lot. What can we learn in particular about beauty? I would say making sure we have the wider adoption of design codes, helping to train those in local government, councillors, but also planning officers in understanding how design codes can be used and how aesthetic judgments can be exercised. The Secretary of State from time to time using his call-in power. Of course, he or she acts in a quasi-judicial capacity, but that call-in power can send a very powerful signal about what is acceptable. And then the work of the Office for Place under Nick Boyce-Smith, brilliant man, again, hugely important. Now, I should add that you can have beautiful buildings that are not in the tradition of the wonderful classical architecture of the very best bits of Newcastle. You can have beautiful modern buildings, system built, with high aesthetic quality to them. But I think the important thing is making sure that people are equipped to make those judgments and making sure that what is built is in tune and in harmony with what already exists. Buildings should be having a conversation with one another, not shouting at one another.
It's very briefly, you say we're talking about, is beauty a luxury we can't afford? Is levelling up a luxury we cannot afford?
No, absolutely not. No, we can't afford not to level up, because if every part of the United Kingdom were as productive as the east of England, London and the southeast, we would be the most productive country in Europe, as well as obviously being the most beautiful.
Right, I just want to get final brief comments to the banks. I know we're running over. Ali, is there anything you want to pick up on there to summarise?
No, other than my name's Abby, not Ali.
Sorry.
That's okay. I think some really interesting discussion. I think the point on culture actually is one we could focus on a lot more. Certainly it's been a key golden thread for us within the city, and I do think there's a huge amount of things both across the agenda that DCMS has led, but also with arm's length bodies like Arts Council England, Historic England and others as well.
Thank you very much. Jonathan?
Yeah, I think it's the same point. I think the suggestion from the audience of bringing funding sources together, getting into a coherent plan, making that plan very clear and guarantee its delivery is absolutely a great point. And I think that's exactly the sort of thing we should do. Just on the point of the modular housing point that Ben said, so it's another example where government can partner with the industry. All of the technology is there to deliver modular housing at pace and scale, but there's no guaranteed supply. There's no aggregation supply, which local authority could do. If they did that, that would enable the private sector to get behind it, build factories, increase productivity in places where they need higher power or higher productive jobs. But that's another example where it's just not joined up, and it could be.
Ike?
Yeah, just end with two really brief points. And the first one about the chap from Newcastle about beauty. I think one of the most pernicious arguments in our public debate at the moment is that beauty is expensive. Beauty is not expensive. It doesn't have to be expensive. I can take you to all manner of buildings around here, not just Birmingham, many cities sadly, which are hugely expensive and horrifically ugly as well. So it's not necessarily a financial relationship. It's much more about the things Michael alluded to, about character, harmony, context, urban environments working well together. And that's a message I think the government's trying to get out, but we all need to work much harder about getting that across. I'd just finally to briefly end with an anecdote. There's a building I came across in my research, and if anyone here is from Lincolnshire, called the Grimsby Ice Factory. Grimsby used to be incredibly wealthy. Used to have the largest fishing port in the world. It doesn't anymore, but this ice factory building is spectacular. It's dilapidated, it's derelict, it's been so for decades. Nobody quite knows how or how to redevelop it in Grimsby. And now, as far as I can see, there's a gap there. There's a gap between the huge economic potential buildings like that ice factory have, buildings which can be found all across the country. There's a gap between delivering that and the economic capacity of cities like Grimsby to deliver it. Levelling Up has to fill that gap.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Jonathan.
Ben.
It's been a long day, I'm so sorry.
I'm not allowed to speak on behalf of Historic England, but we are funding the Ice Factory, so I just want to say that. My message is engage, 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 to make sure that the propositions that come forward for regeneration and levelling up are rooted in the local community, owe their origins in the local community so that people recognise them as stemming from their voice. I've got a little anecdote, if I may. Visiting a coastal town in the northeast, which will remain nameless, it had a housing market renewal fund dropped on it disastrously, which planned to destroy all the terraced properties. It had a dockside regeneration scheme designed by a Sterling Prize-winning architect with a sculpture by Anish Kapoor. And I got into a taxi and I asked the taxi driver, just take me around town. It's a great way of getting to know what's going on. I explained I was there to visit to find out about urban regeneration, and I asked him if he was interested in urban regeneration and what was going on in the town. He said no, he wasn't interested. So far as he was concerned, the only salvation came after death. And he saw absolutely no future in any of those propositions because he had no stake in it. That's my proposition.
Great, well, thank you very much. And as you all can clearly tell, I've been Michael Gove and this is Sebastian Payne here. But all I can say is thank you so much to our panel, to Abby Brown, to Jonathan Moore, to Ike Iger, and to Ben Derbyshire. Thank you all for coming and enjoying this event. I hope you feel very inspired about beauty and places and how to make them all better. Thank you.